Hey everyone, and welcome back. Ready for another deep dive? Today, we are taking a look at The Child Code by Danielle Dick.
Oh, yeah, this one is so
It
interesting.
really is, and we are going to be talking about genetics and child development, and
Hmm.
I'm really looking forward to unpacking this one.
Me too.
I think this is a topic a lot of parents probably think about or worry about, like how much of my kid's personality is on me.
Yeah, for sure. And this book goes right at that.
Mhm.
The idea that parents have all the control. Like, it's a myth.
Like we are just totally responsible for how they turn out.
Exactly.
That's a relief. So Danielle Dick is saying that our genes actually make a big difference here.
Huge difference. It's not all about how we parent.
That makes a lot of sense.
Mm,
I mean, you see siblings who are raised in the same home by the same parents, and they're totally different people.
exactly. And she talks about potty training her own son.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like she had these struggles with potty training, and then she kind of had this realization that a lot of it was his personality.
Like he was just stubborn or something.
Yeah, like really strong-willed, and once she figured that out, it helped her to find a solution.
So she had to kind of work with his natural tendencies.
Exactly.
Hmm. I'm starting to think about like all the times I've been frustrated with my own kids. What if I'm misreading things? Like,
Hmm.
what if it's not just them being difficult, but it's their temperament?
Right. And that's a huge shift, like realizing that kids aren't these blank slates. They come into the world with these tendencies that are already kind of shaping how they see things, how they react to
I
things.
mean, how do we even know for sure that genetics are this powerful?
Well, there's some amazing research out there, like with identical twins who are separated at birth and raised in totally different environments.
I've heard about those
And
studies.
they end up being so similar, it's mind-blowing.
Like even with completely different upbringings.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder, like how much is already decided from the very beginning.
Okay, so that's fascinating. But now I'm thinking, does this mean parenting doesn't matter?
No, no, it's not that simple. It's definitely not an either situation. It's really more about understanding that genes and the environment, they're always interacting.
Like nature and nurture.
Yes, exactly. They're both playing a role.
Okay, so how does that actually work? Like, how do genes and environment interact?
Well, one way is what's called evocative gene-environment correlation.
Evocative gene environment correlation. That's a mouthful.
It is. But it's basically the idea that a child's genes can actually evoke certain responses from their environment, which then reinforces those genetic tendencies.
Okay, so can you give me like a real world example of that?
Sure. Imagine a child who's genetically predisposed to be shy.
Okay,
So they might avoid social situations, right, because they're shy.
makes sense.
But then because they're avoiding those situations, they have fewer opportunities to practice their social skills. And so it kind of becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy.
They just get more and more shy.
Exactly. Their genes influence their behavior, which then shapes their environment, and then that reinforces the shyness.
Wow, that's pretty powerful.
It is.
So what are some other ways that genes and environment interact?
Well, there's also something called passive gene-environment correlation.
Passive gene-environment correlation.
Yeah. So this is where a parent's genes actually influence the environment that they create for their child.
Okay, so like, for example, if I love reading musical,
Yeah.
I'm probably going to have books around the house.
Yeah.
And that's going to create an environment where my kid is exposed to books, even if they don't necessarily inherit my love of reading.
Exactly. You're getting it.
Wow. So I never really thought about it that way. Like my own genes could actually be shaping my child's environment.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about. And it brings us to those key temperament traits that Danielle Dick talks about: extroversion, emotionality, and self-control.
Okay, so those are like the building blocks of personality.
You got it.
So let's break those down a little bit. Tell me more about extroversion.
So extroversion is basically about how outgoing and sociable a child is. So a child who's high in extroversion might be the life of the party. Always buzzing with energy, needs lots of social interaction.
Oh yeah, I know those kids. Always on the go. What about kids who are low in extroversion?
Well, they might be more content with quiet activities. They might prefer smaller social circles, and forcing them into constant social situations could be really overwhelming for them.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking like if you're an introverted parent with a super extroverted kid, that could be a challenge.
Absolutely. It's definitely something to be aware of, and we'll talk more about that later on.
Okay, so we've got extroversion. What about emotionality? What does that mean?
Emotionality is basically about how sensitive a child is to distress or frustration.
Okay.
So highly emotional kids, they experience everything more intensely. The highs are higher, the lows are lower.
So, like, if you have a highly emotional kid and you try to discipline them in a traditional way, like with timeouts or something, it might not be very effective.
Right. It could actually backfire.
Interesting.
Understanding a child's emotionality can really help us choose more effective parenting strategies.
So instead of punishment, what should we be doing?
Well, we can focus on teaching them coping skills.
Yeah.
How to manage those big feelings.
Like helping them to regulate their emotions.
Exactly. And it's also important to remember that their struggles are valid.
Yeah, we don't want to make them feel like they're doing something wrong for feeling things intensely.
Right.
Okay. And what about the third temperament trait, self-control?
So self-control is all about a child's ability to regulate their impulses. Delay gratification, stay focused.
That sounds like a really important skill for just about everything in life.
It really is.
So is that something we can influence as parents, or is it mostly genetic?
That's a great question, and one that we'll dive into a little bit deeper in another episode. It's pretty fascinating.
Okay, well, I'm looking forward to that. But for now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about something that I think a lot of people have heard about, parenting styles.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like there's this idea that every parent kind of falls into one of these categories, right?
Right. So psychologists generally describe four main parenting styles: authoritative, permissive, authoritarian, and neglectful.
Okay, so before we get into like how those play out,
Hmm.
can you just give me like a quick definition of each one?
Of course.
Sometimes those terms get thrown around, and I'm not always sure I totally understand what they mean.
I get that.
Yeah.
So let's start with authoritative parenting. This style is all about warmth, clear expectations, and consistent enforcement of rules.
So it's kind of like the middle ground. You're supportive, but you also have boundaries.
Exactly. Authoritative parents are responsive to their children's needs, but they also set firm limits.
Okay. And then what about permissive parenting?
So permissive parents are more indulgent. They tend to give in to their child's demands to avoid conflict.
Like they just want to keep the peace.
Right. They prioritize their child's happiness above all else.
And so they might not be enforcing rules consistently.
Exactly.
Okay, and how is that different from authoritarian parenting?
Well, authoritarian parents are very strict. They emphasize obedience above all else.
Like my way or the highway?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. They have high expectations, but they're not always as responsive to their children's needs.
Okay, and then lastly, we have neglectful parenting. That one I'm guessing is not so good.
Yeah, unfortunately, neglectful parents are generally uninvolved in their children's lives.
They're not really present.
Right. They might be physically or emotionally absent, and they don't provide much supervision support or guidance.
Okay, so now that we have kind of those basic definitions, let's try to picture like a real life scenario.
Okay, I like that.
Let's say you're at the supermarket and your child throws a complete tantrum.
The dreaded supermarket meltdown.
Screaming, crying, throwing things, the whole works. How would each parenting style approach that situation?
Okay, so let's start by imagining the authoritative parent in that scenario. So they might get down on the child's level, acknowledge their feelings.
Oh, that's good. Like, I see that you're upset.
Exactly. And maybe say something like, I know you're really disappointed that you can't have that candy bar. But then also set a clear limit, like, but we don't throw things in the store.
Right, so validating their feelings, but also setting boundaries.
Exactly. And they might even offer a choice, like, do you want to help me pick out some apples instead?
Okay, so redirecting their attention.
Exactly.
What about a permissive parent? How might they handle that meltdown?
So a permissive parent might be more likely to give in to the child's demands, just to make the tantrum stop.
So, like, they might just buy the candy bar even though they had already said no?
Right. Or they might just leave the store without addressing the behavior at all.
Just to avoid the conflict.
Exactly. And then you have the authoritarian parent.
Okay, how are they going to react?
Well, they might respond with anger or threats. They might yell at the child to stop crying or threaten to punish them if they don't behave.
So their focus is really on obedience.
Yes, obedience is key for the authoritarian parent. They're not necessarily trying to understand the child's feelings.
Okay, and then we have the neglectful parent.
Yeah, and unfortunately, they might not really react at all.
So they might just ignore the tantrum completely.
Right. They might be physically present but emotionally checked out.
Wow.
Or they might not even notice what's happening.
Wow, okay, so we've got these 4 different parenting styles, and they all handle this meltdown in such different ways.
It's pretty amazing to see them side by side like that.
Yeah, and it's making me think about my own tendencies. Like, do I lean more towards one style than another?
It's something to think about. And it's important to remember that no one fits perfectly into one of these categories.
Right, it's not like we're all robots programmed to parent a certain way.
Exactly. We might lean towards one style more than others, but our approach can also vary depending on the situation.
Or like how much sleep we've gotten that day.
Absolutely. Our own stress levels can play a huge role.
So it sounds like there's a lot of nuance here. It's not as simple as just picking a parenting style and sticking to it no matter what.
Right. And it gets even more complicated when you consider that parents often have different styles.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. Like, what if one parent is more authoritative and the other is more permissive?
That can definitely lead to some tension, especially if the parents haven't really talked about their parenting philosophies beforehand.
Because you're sending mixed messages to the kid.
Right. And it can create friction between the parents.
So how do you navigate those differences?
Well, communication is key. And some experts actually believe that a little bit of inconsistency can be good for kids.
Really? How so?
Think about it. In the real world, kids are going to encounter all sorts of different people with different personalities and different ways of interacting.
That's true.
So if they experience a little bit of variation in parenting styles at home, it can actually help them learn to adapt.
Like they're getting a crash course in social flexibility.
Exactly.
But I imagine there's a limit to how much inconsistency is helpful.
Of course. Consistency is still important, especially when it comes to like core values and boundaries.
Right. Like we don't want them to be totally confused about what's expected of them.
Exactly. The key is to find a balance,
Yeah.
allowing for some individual style differences while also presenting a united front on the most important things.
So how do parents find that balance? Like how do you find common ground while still allowing for those individual differences?
Well, like I said, communication is key. You have to talk about your parenting philosophies openly and honestly.
And try to identify areas where you agree and areas where you might need to compromise.
Exactly. It's about respecting each other's perspectives and finding ways to work together as a team.
So it's kind of like any successful partnership. You need to be on the same page, at least in terms of the big picture.
I like that analogy.
But this brings us back to genetics.
Yeah.
Like how does understanding your child's temperament tie into all of this?
Well, recognizing that certain behaviors are rooted in your child's genetic predispositions can help you be a more flexible and understanding parent.
So instead of trying to fix something that's not broken, you can focus on supporting their natural development.
Exactly.
That's such a powerful shift in perspective. Like it takes the pressure off trying to mold them into a certain ideal, and it allows you to appreciate them for who they truly are.
I love that.
But how does that translate to those tough moments like the supermarket meltdown we were talking about?
Well, let's say your child is genetically predisposed to be highly emotional.
Okay.
Knowing that can help you approach those meltdowns with more empathy.
So instead of seeing it as a personal attack or a sign that I'm doing something wrong, I can view it as their natural way of expressing big feelings.
Exactly. You're understanding where they're coming from.
And that understanding can help me tailor my response in a way that's more likely to be effective.
Precisely. For example, you might realize that traditional discipline tactics like timeouts aren't as effective for a highly emotional child.
So I might need to try something different, like teaching them calming techniques
Yeah.
or helping them identify and express their emotions in a healthier way.
Exactly. You're meeting their individual needs. You're not just applying a one-size-fits-all approach.
And this whole concept of understanding your child's temperament, it really ties back to the idea that there's no single right way to parent.
Right. What works for one child might not work for another, even within the same family.
So it's less about finding the perfect parenting formula
Yeah.
and more about figuring out what works best for your unique child and your unique family dynamic.
You got it. And that's where Danielle Dick's book is so helpful. It provides a framework for understanding how genetics influences child development, but it also emphasizes the importance of individual differences and the power of the parent-child relationship.
Yeah, I'm definitely feeling like this whole conversation has really shifted my thinking about the nature versus nurture debate.
It's not about picking sides. It's about recognizing the complexity of human development, this interplay of genes and environment.
And it's about empowering ourselves with knowledge and strategies to become the best parents we can be.
Well said.
So what does all of this mean for you, our listener? Now that you have some insight into the power of genetics and the different ways it can influence your child's behavior, what's one small adjustment you might make in your parenting approach?
Maybe you'll be a little more patient with those tantrums, knowing that they might be driven by your child's innate temperament.
Or maybe you'll start paying more attention to your own parenting style and how it might be aligning or clashing with your child's temperament.
Whatever insights resonate with you, we encourage you to keep exploring this topic. And of course, check out Danielle Dick's book, The Child Code.
It's full of practical advice and thought-provoking research that can help you on your parenting journey.
And remember, even beyond the book, there's so much more to learn and discover.
Exactly. Every deep dive is unique, and we're here to help you explore the knowledge that matters most to you.
So keep those sources coming, and we'll keep exploring together.
Until next time, stay curious.
So the authoritative parent, they're going to try to get down to the kid's level and acknowledge their feelings.
Yeah. So, I see that you're upset you can't have this candy bar.
Exactly, something like that. But they'll also be firm. We don't throw things in the store.
Setting those boundaries.
Right, and maybe offer a choice. Like, hey, do you want to help me pick out some apples or something like that?
Okay, so redirecting their attention.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have the permissive parent.
Okay, what are they doing?
So they're probably going to be more likely to just give in, know.
Just give them the candy bar to stop the tantrum.
Yeah. Or they might just leave the store, completely avoid the whole situation.
Just to avoid conflict.
Right. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have the authoritarian parent.
Okay, so they're not giving in.
No, they're probably going to respond with anger or threats.
Oh, wow. So, stop crying or I'm going to punish you.
Yeah, exactly. Their focus is on obedience, not really on understanding the child's feelings.
And then we have the neglectful parent.
Yeah, and sadly, they might not even react at all.
So they're just completely checked out.
Right, they could be physically there, but emotionally, they're not engaged.
Wow, okay, so it's really interesting to see how those different parenting styles play out in that situation.
Yeah, and it makes you think, how do I usually respond in those situations?
Yeah. I'm definitely thinking about that now.
It's something to be aware of. And of course, no one fits perfectly into one of these categories.
Right. I don't think any parent is 100% one style all the time.
Exactly. Our approach can change depending on the situation, how much sleep we've had. All kinds of things.
So it's not like a black and white thing.
No, definitely not.
And it gets even more complex when you consider that parents often have different styles.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Imagine one parent's authoritative and the other's permissive.
That's going to cause some problems.
It can, especially if they haven't talked about it beforehand,
Right, because the kid's getting mixed messages.
Exactly. And it can create tension between the parents.
So how do you deal with that? Should parents try to be completely consistent all the time?
Well, consistency is important. But some experts actually think that a little bit of inconsistency can be good for kids.
Really? I wouldn't have thought that.
Yeah, think about it in the real world. Kids are going to encounter all kinds of different people with different styles.
That's true.
So if they have some experience with different approaches at home, it can help them learn to adapt,
They're getting practice with different personalities.
Exactly.
But I'm sure there's a limit to how much inconsistency is good for them.
Oh, yeah, of course. You don't want to be totally unpredictable.
Right. They need some consistency.
Exactly. Consistency is crucial for things like core value and boundaries.
So it's about finding that balance.
Right. Allowing for some individual differences, but also presenting a united front when it really matters.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So how do parents actually do that? How do they find that common ground?
Well, communication is so important. They need to talk openly about their parenting philosophies.
And try to find areas where they agree and areas where they might need to compromise.
Exactly. It's about respecting each other's perspectives and being a team,
It's like any good relationship. You got to be able to communicate and work together.
Exactly.
But this brings us back to genetics. How does understanding your child's temperament play into all of this?
Well, when you recognize that some of their behaviors are rooted in their genes,
It's just part of who they are.
Right. It can help you to be a more understanding and flexible parent.
So instead of trying to change them, you can support them.
Exactly.
I love that idea. But how does that actually work in those tough moments, like the supermarket meltdown?
Okay, so let's say your child is genetically predisposed to be highly emotional.
Okay.
Knowing that can help you to approach their meltdowns with more empathy.
So it's not a personal attack. It's just how they express themselves.
Exactly.
And if I understand that, then I can respond in a more helpful way.
Right. You might realize that certain discipline tactics don't work as well for them.
Like timeouts might not be effective.
Right. So maybe you focus on teaching them calming techniques or helping them to identify and express their emotions in a different way.
So you're really tailoring your approach to their individual needs.
Precisely.
And that all ties back to this idea that there's no one right way to parent.
Exactly. What works for one child might not work for another, even within the same family.
So finding that perfect parenting formula, it's kind of a myth.
It is. It's more about figuring out what works best for your child and your family.
And that's where this book is so helpful.
Yeah, Danielle Dick really emphasizes the importance of individual differences.
And understanding the power of the parent-child relationship.
Exactly.
I'm really glad we did this deep dive. It's definitely shifted my thinking about nature versus nurture.
It's not about choosing a side. It's about appreciating the complexity.
Like this beautiful dance between genes and environment.
I love that.
And it's about empowering ourselves as parents,
With knowledge and strategy.
to be the best we can be.
Well,
So what about you, our listener? What insights resonated most with you from this conversation?
and what small adjustments might you make in your own parenting journey?
Okay, so we've been talking a lot about these different parenting styles, but I'm thinking about that supermarket meltdown we were talking about earlier, and like, it's one thing to talk about it theoretically,
Right.
but in the moment, when you're actually dealing with a screaming kid,
Oh, it's so much harder.
yeah, and especially if your partner have different approaches,
Absolutely. Those situations can be so tough.
because you're not only dealing with the kid's emotions, but you're also trying to figure out how you're feeling and how your partner's reacting. It's a lot.
It is, and that's why it's so important to talk about these things beforehand.
Like actually sit down and have a conversation about parenting style.
Right before you're in the heat of the moment.
Because if you could at least agree on a general approach, it'll make those stressful times so much easier.
Absolutely.
So besides communication, are there any other tips for couples who are trying to find a parenting groove that works for both of them?
Well, I think it's helpful to start by identifying the values and goals you share.
Like, what are the most important things you want to instill in your child?
Yeah, exactly. Like, do you both agree on the importance of kindness, respect, responsibility, things like that?
Yeah, those fundamental values.
Right. Once you have that shared foundation, it's easier to work through the differences in your approach.
So it's not about being identical in every single parenting decision.
No, it's more about having a unified vision.
Like we're both working towards the same big picture.
Exactly. And sometimes those differences in style can actually be a good thing.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, think about it. Kids benefit from being exposed to different perspectives.
Right, like it takes a village.
Yeah. And even within the family, one parent might be more nurturing and emotionally expressive, while the other is more focused on structure and discipline.
So it's like they're getting a more well-rounded experience,
Exactly. And they're learning that there's no one right way to do things.
which is a great lesson for life.
It is. It teaches them to be flexible and adaptable.
So I guess what we're saying is it's okay for parents to have their own unique styles.
Right. As long as there's respect and communication.
And it's an ongoing process.
Absolutely. Parenting is all about learning and adjusting as you go.
There's no finish line.
Right. You never really have it all figured out.
This whole conversation has been so eye-opening for me.
Me too.
Like, there's so much more to parenting than just following a set of rules.
It's about understanding your child
Yeah, their individual needs, their temperament, and working with them to help them thrive.
and recognizing that genetics plays a role, but it doesn't determine everything.
Right? We have the power to create a supportive environment.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a fantastic deep dive. I feel like we've covered so much.
Me too.
But now I want to hear from you, our listener. What insights resonated most with you from this conversation?
And what small adjustments might you make in your own parenting journey?
Remember, every deep dive is custom made just for you. Send us your sources and we'll explore the knowledge that matters most to you. Until next time, stay curious.